Good afternoon. My name is Dennis Speed, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the International Schiller Institute to today's webcast. Next week, on December 12th and 13th, there will be an international conference of the Schiller Institute entitled The World After the United States Election, Creating a World Based on Reason. And we're asking that you register today for that conference. This will be a 4-panel conference, the first of which will discuss actually a report from an international commission on truth in the elections. And we will be discussing many matters of a strategic nature. In fact, the overall idea of the conference is called the coincidence of opposites. And the concept that we have is that this is a weekend in which we are trying to give people the tools, the intellectual tools, to figure out how to deploy the principle of power in the American presidency on behalf of the world at large and the United States in particular. Now, in order to do that, what we're going to do today is start by discussing something about the presidency, which Lyndon LaRouche, who ran for president as a Democrat 7 times and once as an independent, 1976. In 1980, during his run for president of the United States as a Democrat in New Hampshire, Lyndon LaRouche surprised an interviewer who was asking him about his idea of great presidents by referring to Charles de Gaulle of France, the self-declared leader of the resistance to the Nazis from June of 1940 to August 1944, as an exemplar of how to conduct a presidency. He also distinguished, that is, LaRouche distinguished, between governing by merely passing laws and governing by allowing the citizens of the United States or any other nation to deliberate together with the presidency.
But Charles de Gaulle is probably the most remarkable leader of this figure, even though he's wrongly deprecated in this country, big propaganda against him. De Gaulle did in the middle of the 1950s, when France was in a grave crisis, he stepped forward and said he had to become the president of France. He had no elected position at the time. He was coming totally from the outside. And he said, here's a crisis, I must step in and lead France out of this crisis. He succeeded. That's how the Fifth Republic was constituted. And France was, well, it still has many shortcomings today, was brought out of this hideous condition which had been wallowing for decades and began to develop around nuclear energy, around its aerospace and a few other things, began to develop. De Gaulle had a conception of France which is my conception of the United States. The function of a nation is to lead, give that nation a moral purpose in the world. Then the people of the nation, through the nation, are participating in shaping the future of humanity, which is what our Constitution dedicates us to. It's the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for ourselves, but more importantly, our posterity, the kind of world we're creating. De Gaulle had that. He understood that. And he was therefore, in my opinion, one of the greatest leaders of the present century. The function of a leader is not merely to pass laws. Laws are sometimes necessary, but we have an excess of dependence on laws, and passing a lot of laws is a symptom of a weak leader. The way you get things done in anything, and especially government, is the function of a president is to define national goals and to appeal to the national consensus for those goals. And then you find the combination of public and private initiative, but particularly private initiative, will just get the thing done. And that's the way it works. And that's what's been lacking. There's been, people are saying, let's amend the Constitution to this, let's pass this law, let's pass that. Sometimes that's necessary, but in general there's an excess of that. The function of a president is not to pass a lot of laws. The function of a president is to be the instrument of self-government of a people, to provide the kind of leadership that they seek by selecting national goals which the overwhelming majority of people will get behind, and which private initiative largely will get done, with government supporting that action by private initiative.
LaRouche went on in that same interview to identify Abraham Lincoln as the outstanding example of American presidential leadership.
I think you have to give outstanding points to Abraham Lincoln. He was undoubtedly the greatest figure. He's deprecated as some sort of a simple-minded fellow. He did have humility, and I think that's necessary in a leader. There's an area which a leader is really an instrument of a higher purpose. Is not some kind of a dictator who has got an absolute authority. He is the servant of a higher purpose, like a priest or a pope, the same thing. And therefore, the leader must be, in a sense, represent and lead in terms of competence, but he must have, at the same time, the humility which reflects the fact that he is the instrument of a higher purpose. He must radiate that, as well as believing that and living from that standpoint. Lincoln had precisely that quality. He saved our nation. He preserved the foundations which the Founding Fathers had attempted to give us, and embedded in our nation an organic impulse that we call the American system, the American way of doing things, which, despite many distortions imposed on the top, that up until a recent time, our people have had a special quality we call the American method, the American way of looking at things, which, despite all its perfections, is the best thing there is in the world in terms of a people. And Lincoln was the person who secured and gave us that perspective. I think those are examples of real leaders.
The importance of understanding Abraham Lincoln as an international leader is essential to understand the actual principle of the Republican Party and why it was created. It was not merely created against slavery. It wasn't simply the case that persons like Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, because of their staunch opposition to that institution, had joined and had created the Republican Party as a revolutionary institution back in 1856. It was that there was a principle of republicanism that Abraham Lincoln in particular represented, and he represented that from the standpoint of his conception of the idea of progress and of the idea of economics that was known as the American system. More Americans have to be and should become familiar with the actual tradition and precedent, their actual ancestors on the question of economy, because our conception of economy does not come from Adam Smith, does not come from England, and it does not come from Karl Marx, who also comes from England. It's not that. It's something different. The economist Henry Charles Carey, who was the economic advisor of Abraham Lincoln, developed something called the American system. And that conception is the one that Abraham Lincoln brought with him into the presidency of the United States. If we can have the first portrait of, I believe that's Matthew Carey, who was the father of Henry Charles Carey. He was a protege of Benjamin Franklin, brought to the United States at the age of 15, 16 as a pamphleteer. And he and his son did an extensive critique of Adam Smith, the very Adam Smith that everybody always talks about as the founder of capitalist theory. They talk about his Wealth of Nations, that of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, as being the basis of capitalism, when in fact that was a document written against the United States, and which was a document that supported the continuation of the plantation slave system against the system that Hamilton represented, and Matthew Carey wrote about that system. Next. Abraham Lincoln, in his first months in office, initiated the transcontinental railway system as a way of beginning a process of doing something that had not been done ever before in human history, unifying a continent by means of the most advanced technological systems for transportation that were then in existence. He did this because he was fulfilling John Quincy Adams' foreign policy, sometimes mistakenly referred to as manifest destiny, but actually a system of creating a way of defeating England without necessarily fighting the British Empire. And this was something that he was extending during the period of the 1861 to 65 war, often called the Civil War, by using two emissaries in particular that I want to point about. And the first is Cassius Marcellus Clay. You've all heard the name as a result of Muhammad Ali, but very few understand who this is. Cassius Marcellus Clay of Kentucky was Lincoln's ambassador to Russia, and he was the person that negotiated together with Tsar Alexander II a joint freeing of the serfs of Russia and the slaves of the United States. And this was being done as a way of creating, together with Russia, a kind of joint alliance against England, and particularly the naval power of England. It was precisely because of Cassius Marcellus Clay's work earlier as an abolitionist in Kentucky, where he became famous for his fighting, including often finding himself in the position of having to dispatch his enemies with extreme prejudice. In other words, he killed a couple of people who at different times tried to challenge him for his stand against slavery. And he was sent originally to Russia, partially to get him out of Kentucky. But there he worked together with Lincoln's idea of the American system and Tsar Alexander II. And they created the alliance that ultimately ended up with, of course, the sale of Alaska to the United States. It also caused the Russian Navy to be dispatched to New York and San Francisco in support of Lincoln during 1862, and is the actual precedent for the ideas of unifying the Pacific through things like the Bering Strait Tunnel concept, in which the United States and Russia, which are actually about 30 miles apart, would be linked by something very much like the transcontinental railroad system that Lincoln talked about. The second individual I'd like to talk about here or bring up is Anson Burlingame, virtually completely unknown to Americans. He was the ambassador that Lincoln sent to China, a China that was still subjugated in the immediate aftermath of the Opium War by the British Empire. And this was done in anticipation of what Lincoln wished to extend to China as an additional international diplomacy. Burlingame became so beloved of the Chinese that after in 1867 he had fulfilled his entire tour of duty for the United States, he became the ambassador of China to both the United States and to Europe. And this alliance was essential also for what was the work that was being done on the transcontinental railway system. For purposes of time, we're not going to take a lot more time here. If we have a shot of the transcontinental railway system, we can perhaps have that come up just so people have a sense of what that looked like. But I'll just say to you that the idea of Abraham Lincoln's presidency was an international presidency. And for the first time in human history, the interior of a continent was linked. When you talk about the Belt and Road Initiative of China, when you talk about the Trans-Siberian Railway system, when you talk about the linking of any areas of the world during the period of the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, whether we're talking about Peru, we're talking about the work of people like Wharton Barker in China, we're talking about the work of people like Erasmus Passion Smith in Japan. Wherever we're talking about that was work of the American system of Abraham Lincoln. And the idea was that Lincoln's presidency would be the means for the liberation of people from slavery and serfdom throughout the world. So that is the actual concept of the American presidency that we are attempting to talk about a little bit today, in the context of the fact that we have President Donald Trump, who refuses to admit a lie, which is that he was defeated in the election fairly. That never occurred. The election was stolen, and it was done in multiple ways. And despite the fact that people have attempted to argue that because the legal constraints around proving vote fraud in a court of law are too high for that to be done in the time allotted, therefore everything should be abandoned. That's not right. That's not the conception of the American presidency, and it's not the idea of a self-governing of a people by the use of the American Constitution. The American Constitution requires that people actually mobilize on behalf of the general welfare of the United States. And when something is done, like the crime that is now unfolding in the United States, it is the right and duty of the people to stand up against that crime, but they must do it within the domain and confines of the Constitution. You can't talk about weird ideas like insurrection or martial law or other such things. You have to actually have an ability to mobilize people according to an idea of principle. And so to discuss this concept of the principle of power of the American presidency and of presidencies as a whole, we're going to hear from two people today. We're going to start with Harley Schlanger, who I think everybody will know, who has watched particularly his blog posts and so forth, and his daily briefings. So we'll go first to Harley.
Well, thank you, Dennis, and good afternoon, everyone. As Dennis just identified, the fight over the presidency is a real fight. It's an ongoing fight. And it's a battle that, as to this point, Donald Trump has held firm to his belief that he won the election and is committed to defending his presidency from what has been proven to have been a fraudulent election campaign. Now, what I'm going to develop in looking at this is the picture of, on first part, what is the evidence that's come forward that the media denies, that the Democrats deny, and many Republicans are now denying. But then secondly, to get to this question of how presidential power, when used in a constitutional way, is what's necessary to overturn this fraud. How you find the flanks within the law that can give you a capability to fight back and win. Now, keep in mind when I'm speaking, this is not just a problem for the United States. The situation in the United States is being watched very closely all over the world for two reasons. One, because the United States is a great power because of our tradition, our history, our economic development, and our military power, which when used for the good is necessary for the whole world. But it's also being watched from around the world because when we go bad, when things are done poorly or on the side of corruption around the world, as it has been. For example, we have intervened in elections in other countries repeatedly. And by we, I don't mean the American people. I mean the people who are trying to overturn Donald Trump, the shadow government, the deep state, the military-industrial complex. This has now come home to roost. They used some of the technologies they've deployed against other countries in the United States. And so with that as a sort of a preamble, let me get to the substance of my comments. I want to start with what Dennis finished with, the loose talk that's out there that because of the corruption, because of the fraud, and because there seems to be no legal remedy, there should be a suspending of the Constitution, declaration of martial law, mass arrests, rounding people up, even holding a new election. And at the same time, blaming other countries, Russia and China in particular, for participating in the fraud. This kind of loose talk does nothing to defend the president and to defend the right to vote, which is a sacred right in the United States, the right to have your vote counted, and that illegal votes not be counted. So what we have to start with is what are the remedies that are available and what are the flanks we can bring in to make sure those remedies succeed. Now, again, contrary to the media line that there's no evidence, that it's a baseless charge that there was fraud in the campaign or a conspiracy theory, which is what they say, massive evidence exists. It's been presented, hundreds, I think 600 affidavits so far, from poll watchers, from people who participated in the election process, who point to irregularities in the way the votes were counted, as to who was voting, whether there was adequate safeguards to know that someone was a legitimately registered voter or not. There's massive evidence on this that's been presented. There are rule changes that took place. For example, in Pennsylvania, to allow the extension of the time in which votes could be accepted as legitimate. A rule change, I might add, that goes against the Constitution of Pennsylvania and against the rules of the state, which give only the legislature the right to change these deadlines. It was usurped by the Secretary of the Commonwealth, and that in itself could be the basis of throwing out the Pennsylvania vote. So there's a lot of evidence that is there that has to be sorted through. Take the time to do it. This is too important to allow the media to brush things away and say it's a conspiracy theory, it's a fraud, it's not true, there's no evidence. Take the time. It's owed to the American people that people who voted, including people who went to vote in person at this time of the corona crisis, their vote they should know that their vote was legitimate and was counted. So that's an important point to consider. The second area of combat, besides the legal side, going before, I should say that this evidence is now being presented in courts. And look, a lot of corruption exists in the legal system in this country. That's not something new that I'm telling you. But we see judges who don't even look at the evidence, don't even concern themselves with what's being compiled and put together, whether that's pressure, blackmail, being practical, going along with the media. Who's to say? But the court system is not the only remedy. In fact, the Constitution gives a second remedy, which is a political remedy. Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 of the U.S. Constitution gives to state legislatures the authorization over the selection of electors. And this has been brought up in several legal cases and affirmed, which means that if legislators in state Senate and state houses can look at the evidence and find that the electoral slate which has been certified was certified on false pretenses, they can throw it out. They can reverse it. And this is something which has been already done in the past. Now, there are state legislative hearings in Pennsylvania, in Arizona, Michigan, and Georgia. And these hearings had ample evidence of irregularities in the voting process, what Attorney Sidney Powell calls the old-fashioned ballot stuffing, to at least bring this the outcome into question. But then it's supplemented by something else, something that's more nefarious, an electronic form of vote stuffing, ballot stuffing, electronic fraud, cyber fraud. And we heard last week from Bill Binney, one of the leading experts on cyber technologies, that it's not only possible, but likely that the computer technologies that were used to capture the votes and then count them included systems within them that could flip votes, switch votes, rig an election. It's been done all over the world. And in fact, one of the leading figures of Smartmatic voting systems, Lord Malloch Brown, who's a member of the Queen's Privy Council, Malloch Brown has implicated himself in using these practices in regime change before, going back to 1986 in the Philippines. So when the media and the Democrats slam the president as saying he's refusing to accept his defeat, that they're buying into a conspiracy theory, the voters who support Trump are prone to conspiracy theories, what about machines that are prone to fraud, including urban political machines run by Democrats in major cities in the battleground states, as well as the voting machines? Why is that not being addressed and looked at? Now, so you have the legal remedies in the courts, including the possibility of going to the Supreme Court, and the evidence of the electronic fraud. But what else is there that the president himself can do? There's a lot of power in the hands of the executive in our American system. And these executive powers can be utilized. They can be utilized in many ways for economic policy, the way Franklin Roosevelt did to get the United States out of the Great Depression. One of the things Lyndon LaRouche pointed out is these economic processes and social processes as well are not statistical, but they're dynamic, and that they will move based on the better ideas that are brought to bear in solving problems. That's what our Constitution allows. The General Welfare Clause is written not because there are fixed rules of the system, but there are principles which underlie the governing of our nation. And those principles are susceptible to human reason and can be changed, or not the principles changed, but the policies changed based on adherence to those principles. Now, the problem we have is that our economic policy and strategic policy in the United States, and virtually everything else we do, is not controlled by the American system anymore. It's controlled by the British system. Now, many people want to quibble about this. Fine, let's quibble about it. Let's get to the truth here. Because if you actually understand economics, what you can see is that the policies of the United States since 1971 in particular, but even going back to the fight at the end of World War II, the economic policies which led America, as Dennis was just discussing, to become a great power, have been subverted by a move to British free market policies, deregulation, globalization, anti-sovereignty. And that's the way we've lived, especially since 1971. What about strategic policy? Why are we in all these wars? Are these wars a benefit to the United States? No, they're the acting out of a doctrine called geopolitics, which essentially defines fixed national objectives, but does it at the expense of other nations so that nations can be manipulated from the outside over ethnicity, over economics, over tribalism, over religion. And that's what we've seen. That's the specialty of the British geopolitical elite. You can also control the way people think. We see that in the United States. They're trying to do that with media. And many people are turning off the mainstream media, but there's still many people victimized by it. And now we have big tech, which is a part of the conglomerate, which is shaping not only what news we're getting, but how we think. And I think we should have some discussion of this in the future. The way that the big media, social media, and so on, is actually changing the way people make their decisions and how people think about the world. Now, all of these things, the economic policy, the strategic policy, and social policy, they're all operating under the control of a globalized cartel, a corporate cartel, which includes finance, it includes insurance, it includes big pharma, it includes media, energy, and so on. Interlocking corporations, many of which get their marching orders from the City of London. And the reason that they're moving so aggressively to overturn Donald Trump's reelection is they're committed to something for their own survival. They're crashing. Their system is going. It's a systemic crisis. And what they're facing is a loss of power if the United States sticks with Trump and goes with sovereign policies. These policies can be then expanded to include cooperation with Russia, with China, with Japan, with some European countries if the Europeans break from the European Union. You could have a world of sovereign nation states engaged in cooperative policies that would address both the financial and collapse and the collapse of manufacturing and productive goods production, but would also take up the problems of poverty, the spread of disease, the spread of famine, the lack of water, resource problems. All of these could be addressed by sovereign nation states cooperating. And that's what this corporate globalist elite does not want. So they're going for a global reset of finance with the green agenda, with new trade deals. They're going for more wars. This is the Biden agenda. Green agenda, shut down technology, accelerate the deindustrialization, and more wars. And what they're saying is that Trump never agreed to play by the rules. He did not accept this, which is true. He didn't accept the globalization. He ran to stop the wars. He ran to take us out of these fraudulent supranational agreements, such as the Paris Climate Accord and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's why he was attacked, and that's why they tried to oust him. Now they're saying, look, Trump, you lost. Play by the rules. Concede, walk away, admit you lost. Now, how should he respond? On the one hand, he's responding perfectly properly by refusing to accept the fraud. But I want to give him a few words, and you a few words from Lyndon LaRouche, on how a presidency in the American system can address this kind of crisis. This was from a presentation, I believe it was in 2007. But what he said is, in talking about how a leader has to fight to establish the principle of our system in the minds of the American citizens. He said, see, we are not emperors. We cannot, with a wave of a hand, declare a principle and then impose it by our will on people. The way we convey a principle is as philosophers in action, who convince people that that principle is the way in which they ought to live and act. When a people is aroused to act for that principle, then the great good comes. No man is a god. No man can decree by a wave of the hand and give the world something according to principle. What a man can do, an individual human being, is to transmit ideas, utilize ideas, convey them to others. The function of leadership is essentially that of a philosopher, which few politicians seem to understand. And then he goes on to talk about what is the principle of the American system. It's that we define self-interest as the general welfare, and the general welfare for today and for our posterity. And as our first leaders understood, that principle was not limited to the United States, but should govern our activity in relations to other countries. So Lynn talks about it this way. He says, when somebody talks about my self-interest, what is their self-interest? If you're going to die, what becomes of your self-interest the minute you die? Your self-interest in pleasure? Your self-interest in gluttony? Your self-interest in riches? What happens to those things? They go. What's your self-interest? Your self-interest is in having lived and having your life mean something to humanity. So you live for your self-interest. Now, I would argue that today, reversing the election fraud is in the self-interest of every American. Now, what can the president do? He's pursuing the legal options. He's pursuing the political options. I think he has to go further. I think he has to change the battlefield. That's what we mean. That's what LaRouche always meant by talking about flanking actions. So let me give you 3 points that are something that he could take up that would change the battlefield. First, full declassification of all the secret documents that are involved in the post 9/11 surveillance state, the wars that were conducted illegally based on lies, and then especially the Russiagate story. Get it all out into the open. Everything having to do with Russiagate, the Ukraine impeachment, the surveillance state as used by the shadow government to spy not just on the American people, but on the president. This would include the secret wars. That means what Julian Assange exposed, the regime change wars. And this gets to an important point in this election in particular, the role of Joe Biden. Now, I know many Americans, including a lot of Trump supporters, say that Biden is corrupt because of the Hunter Biden story, the money coming from Burisma, the fact that Joe Biden enriched himself because of his position, using his son as a surrogate and so on. Well, that's probably true. How did Barack Obama get to become a multimillionaire? Look at the Clintons. Look at George W. Bush. Look at Dick Cheney. That's unfortunately an embedded practice in American politics. But that's not the real corruption. The problem is that people who define their self-interest from the standpoint of money and personal advancement fall sucker to these kinds of stories when the bigger corruption gets missed. What's the bigger corruption on Ukraine? It's that Joe Biden was the point man for a policy which put the United States on a potential course for nuclear war with Russia. And how did he do it? He worked with the most disreputable people in the world, the oligarchs in Ukraine who were being enticed by membership in the European Union and NATO, by neoconservatives like Victoria Nuland, whose husband, Robert Kagan, was one of the founders of the Project for a New American Century and became a dinner partner with Barack Obama during his administration, because Obama was and is a neocon. It included the Hillary Clinton networks, in particular represented by John Kerry, who at that time was Secretary of State. It included George Soros and the non-governmental organizations that were involved in the coup in Ukraine. And it included support for Nazi militia units, the Azov Battalion and the Banderistas, who traced their heritage to the Ukrainians who joined the Nazi SS in World War II to exterminate Hungarians, Romanians, Poles, Jews, and Russians who lived in Ukraine. That's Joe Biden's corruption. He worked with these corrupt, evil people to overthrow a government, bring in the International Monetary Fund, and then use that as an advanced deployment of NATO against Russia. Can we put someone in the presidency with that history? But why didn't that come out in the campaign? Well, because people were more interested in Hunter Biden cavorting with young girls and prostitutes and making some money than they were with the strategic issue. And on the British side of this, you know who was sending back memos from Ukraine during the period of the so-called Maidan Revolution in 2014 that were being used by the State Department to formulate American policy in Ukraine? Christopher Steele, the former MI6 operative who later ended up putting together the dossier used from Russiagate against Trump. So the first thing that Trump should do is full declassification. And this may mean he has to fire Gina Haspel. He may have to fire Christopher Wray. He should do that anyway. And if necessary, bring in someone like Grenell, who showed as Director of National Intelligence that you can get these documents released. Now, the second thing, President Trump has talked about it. Bring in a special prosecutor. Election fraud is a criminal offense, not just a civil offense. Bring in a special prosecutor who will take the evidence that's been compiled and take it to the extreme, that is, prove it. Subpoena people. You know, we just saw this video in Atlanta of people sneaking in votes after they threw out the poll watchers. How about deposing every single one of those people and see what we can get from them? Will they talk about what they did? So a special prosecutor would be another way that the president can change the rules in this whole investigation. And then the third thing, pardon Ed Snowden and Julian Assange, promise them safe passage to the United States, and let them tell the American people what's been done in their name by these corporate cartels, these military-industrial complex manipulators, people who spend your money to destroy nations, to frame people up, to assassinate people, like Obama and John Brennan, who would meet every Tuesday to determine who are they going to assassinate by drones in Iraq and Syria. The same Obama who claims to be committed to human rights is a murderer, violating international law. We've got to get this to the American people so they can see in detail what's been done in their name and on their dollar. Now, were President Trump to take these three steps, full declassification, and then supplement that declassification by bringing in Assange and Snowden, that would have an enormous impact on how Americans think about things. That it's not just an election where we say, well, I like President Trump, I like that he stands up against the media, that he doesn't go along with political correctness. No, he was waging a fight to end the control of the unipolar policy that came out of the British and the neocons in the United States, especially after the end of the Cold War. He was trying to break that by forming friendly, cooperative relationships with Russia and China and others. We saw what he got started with North Korea before it was sabotaged by John Bolton and Pompeo. So this was a shift underway in America's post-Cold War policy, which threatened the interests of the City of London and Wall Street and the war hawks who they pay and the think tanks that they sponsor. And this is our best chance to overturn the fraud. By all means, continue the investigations, the legal cases, bringing it before the state legislatures, but then throw this in on top of it. And there's one other thing he could do. Before he leaves office, assuming he does not overturn the fraud, set up to have the meeting that President Putin has called on, the P5, the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, to meet to discuss what must be done. This is especially important if Trump is eventually reelected and serves a second 4-year term. But it's crucial that this take place. Now, finally, this brings up what the task for the American people. What Lyndon LaRouche identified in that little passage I read is redefining what we see as our self-interest. Our self-interest as Americans is to live up to the tradition and the principles in our Constitution. But that means not just for ourselves, but for the future and for the whole world. We have, in the past, when we've been called upon as a nation, we've risen to that occasion. Are we going to do that again? And can the president, by taking these actions, inspire us to get beyond the littleness which is imposed on us by the media, the social media, the go along to get along mentality? But can Americans again think like what were called the Greek tradition of the American Revolution, study of Plato, study of Leibniz, looking at great ideas and applying those ideas and to the dynamic process of self-government? That's what has to happen, because it's not just about overturning an election. It's about restoring the principles on which our nation was built. So thank you, and I'll look forward to your questions when we get to the Q&A.
Thanks a lot, Harley. Before we go to our next speaker, I just want to point out that we've received a statement from Philip Sokolimane, who is the leader of the LaRouche movement in South Africa, called Urgent Appeal for Aid in Fighting Killer Virus and Famine in Africa. Africa Needs You, President Trump. We will refer to the content of the statement as we get into the questions and answers and discussion process. And the statement will also be featured. Philip, I believe, will also be with us on Sunday, next Sunday, on December 13th. Again, our conference is December 12th and 13th, The World After the United States Election, Creating a World Based on Reason. We're asking that you go there and that you register for that conference today. We want to get thousands of people involved with us there. And again, if you're a citizen of any nation who wants to fight for the kind of freedom and sovereignty that is necessary in today's world, we talk about the idea that you can be a patriot and a world citizen at the same time. You should join the Schiller Institute and join us for that conference next weekend. Now, like Lyndon LaRouche, Jacques Cheminade has run for the presidency in France and the principle of the presidency in France in the image of Charles de Gaulle. Among other things, he might give us some insight today into what Lyndon LaRouche meant in that 1980 New Hampshire video that we showed when he said that my idea of the United States is like the idea that de Gaulle had of France. Jacques has been associated with Lyndon LaRouche not only for several decades, but in one sense for over 2,500 years. Lynn used to say all the time that you don't know anything about what you're doing as a citizen of any nation unless you've got at least 2,500 years worth of history under your belt. And because of what Jacques has had to do, I think it's safe to say that he's known Lyndon LaRouche for about that long. So I always like to introduce Jacques, and here he is to speak to us. Jacques?
Thank you very much, Dennis. What I'm going to tell you this evening appears to be an old story, which happened in 1995, during the French presidential election then. It is not an old story. I was then slandered and silenced because I represented Lyndon LaRouche's ideas and Charles de Gaulle and Jean Jaurès, the socialist that opposed World War I. The consequences of what they did to me in those years are, of course, relatively little compared to what they did to compared to the prison years that our members and Lyndon LaRouche himself spent in the United States. But they are part of the same injustice and scam. I thought that it was necessary to explain it to you, first because it proves that they didn't do to us all, what they did to us in the United States is something pertaining to an overall world policy beyond a matter of American or French parochialisms. Second, I'm going to tell you about it because I am not posing as a personal victim, but as an accuser of the political transatlantic mafia that led us to the present disaster. The mafia of the City of London, of Wall Street, and their local accomplices, servants, or submissive cowards. And together with you, I fight to define a final, conclusive way out of the rule. I was in the United States between 1972 and 1977 in New York. I worked 1 year then with the economic file of LaRouche's party, your party. Then I came back to France. I met the LaRouche organization, the National Caucus of Labor Committees at that time, on the mid-1974. As soon as I came to a Lyndon LaRouche meeting on December 28, 1974, the FBI spotted me and wrote a report. We have a sense of what the FBI since then did to us, did to me afterwards, through the Freedom of Information Act. On September 1976, they allegedly closed down their report because I had first a diplomatic status then, but more than that, and I quote them, I was unwilling to cooperate and presented no political intention to be an informer. That's the way they speak. I only needed to be followed very closely, what they did. On December 22, 1983, the FBI ordered to their representatives in Paris, Bonn, and Rome, in the US embassies, to check what I was doing in Europe and prevent the LaRouche movement to spread in Europe through me. In January 1985, the legal attaché of the US Embassy in Paris concluded, better to say, that there was no legal basis against me because our informants on the issue were all doubtful, which is funny coming from them. But as for my political activities, it remained an open issue and I need to be followed closely. What happened? It is then, and most notably in the French presidential election of 1995, where I was for the first time candidate, that all the French media repeated what the New York Times, the Washington Times, and even the pro-drug Howard Times were saying on LaRouche. You have to understand that France, and that's very important for an American audience, that France is the only country in Europe that has a presidential election by universal vote. No parliament system as such, but something comparable in certain ways to the American system, thanks to the referendum that De Gaulle organized in 1962 to have this presidential election. A case then was opened against me and my close collaborators to have stolen money from an old lady. It was the heirs that protested, pretending that she had Alzheimer's disease at the time she was playing tennis and driving her car. A first judge closed the case immediately. But then the state appealed to reopen the case and find judges that were suitable to sentence against me. They have sentenced finally me after 10 years of 9 months of suspended jail sentence, a sanction not inscribed in the criminal record, but did not prevent them to say all the time that I was a convicted felon. I was also condemned to pay back 1 million francs at the time, which was the sum that this old lady had loaned us. It was her loan, and most of it was given to us. It was beyond the loan. The portion of the loan was minimal, and we had to pay it over a longer time. But they demanded immediate payment of everything: the loan, what she has donated, everything. And they said the old lady, she was 67, 13 years younger than I am tonight. So that was the case. The trial lasted between 1986, the same year of the FBI raid against Leesburg, until 1996, the point being to taint continuously my reputation. During the whole French presidential campaign of 1995, I was described as a thief of old ladies, and the police officer in charge of the investigation stressed that, it's a quote, our methods were the same as those of the LaRouche organization in the United States. That makes the point clear. The 580 mayors that had signed for me, I would later explain how it works, were harassed by the media all the time, and also some local police people. I was described as an agent of suspicious foreign forces. Not French, in any case, I was not French. I was as an agent of the Americans, the Russians, the Soviets at the beginning, Saddam Hussein, the KGB, the CIA, and even at a point, for people that were against it, agent of the Mossad and some other obscure forces. This has continued since then. After comes the scandal of the non-reimbursement of my campaign expenses, but the ground was prepared. This is I want to tell you, same as for our organization in the United States, which then went beyond the beyonds. In France, so I have to precise, you can run as a presidential candidate if you get 5,000 signatures sponsoring your candidacies of local mayors, which is 1.5% of the total number of mayors. Everybody was shocked that a foreign agent like me and a thief of old ladies got these signatures. This is referred to the Constitutional Council, which has the capacity to check about the electoral process. In de Gaulle's conception, it was a council representing the highest form of the law of the nation. It was entitled to check the accounts in the presidential elections as a consequence of that commitment. But also the worm was in the apple. The members of the council are called to duties, 3 representing the President of the Republic, 3 the President of the Senate, and 3 the President of the National Assembly. The former head had been Roland Dumas when my case was examined, when the 1995 election took place. François Mitterrand had put him in that position, even if he said all the time that Robert Badinter was his lawyer for legal cases, this is another lawyer, and Roland Dumas for dubious operations. So there you have at the head of the Constitutional Council a man that Mitterrand himself, the President of the Republic, called a lawyer for dubious operations. The present head of the Constitutional Council is Laurent Fabius, who had supported the Front al-Nusra in Syria, the jihadists, against Bashar al-Assad, saying that these jihadists do our job in a very competent way. As for the campaign accounts, they have been checked by 2 Socialist Party members and sympathizers who were against me. And the 9 members of the Constitutional Council and these 2 rapporteurs, these 2 people checking the accounts, all decided against my accounts and decided to reject my political campaign account for excess of political donations. What was this? Well, you are allowed to get money donated by people in an election. In that case, you have also right to have money lended by people. what they said is my loans were without interest. So they had to be requalified as donations because the lack of interest means that, in fact, people were inspired to donate instead of to lend. So this is absolutely crazy because the civil code in France says that on the nature of interest, says that a loan is considered by its obligation to reimburse, and there could be interest attached to it. So obligation to reimburse and not interest enters into the definition. And the tax code says that there are zero interest rate loans, and they describe them. So the Constitutional Council did not care for the law and decided in the absolute opposite way. So my account was then rejected, and I had to pay back the 170,000 loan, so-called, which was in fact a loan, from the people that helped our campaign to continue. So why? Because my account was rejected, and they said it's not loans, it's donations, and these donations are too much, so you cannot be accepted. So at this point, obviously, people recognize that it was fake. Now that the accounts have been published, and that's how I'm speaking to you 25 years after. There is 25 years of confidentiality. Now the accounts have to be are going to be open, and also the discussions in the Constitutional Council. So what they said is that I got loans that are suspicious, it's too many money. It's 100 times less than the other big candidates, but they say it's too much for such a small candidate. But they had to recognize, even on the radio now, they did not have absolute proof of this, while they have regularly argued that doubt must benefit to the candidates in the case of Chirac and Balladur accounts, the big candidates, which accepted. The wise men, the Constitutional Council members, decided to sanction the small candidates, the small candidate, me. To do so, they had to find a legal bias. They considered that the absence of interest on a loan could be considered as an illegal donation. So, as I said, this is beyond of the beyonds because it violates the rule of the country, the law of the country. While the accounts of Chirac and Balladur were checked because everybody knew that Chirac and Balladur went above all the legally accepted expenses. So the Constitutional Council members between July and October 1995 discussed about the cases of these two people after decided first to reject me, and also Le Pen, who was a candidate of the extreme right wing. So they decided not to check Le Pen because he's considered part of the system that is revealing, and the two other candidates, the two right-wingers, they decided to change the accounts, to arrange the accounts, and they did it, but they could not get the numbers under the limit of the expenses, the accepted limit of the expenses. So they had a problem, and this is when the General Secretary of the Constitutional Council came with a solution. He said, well, what here happens is that these people make these expenses. But to prove that it was under the will, you need a signed element of proof from them telling that these accounts were made on their behalf. So you had a situation where the people that spoke for them, the spokespersons, their friends, the people that were organizing the campaign, made a lot of expenses, and it was not included in the campaign as for Chirac and Balladur. So it's very funny of what, at this point, they had to say. Roland Dumas, who was the president of the Constitutional Council, he was interviewed in a program in 2011. And he said that they had to justify the accounts of Balladur and Chirac, despite he acknowledged that they were not legal. They had to certify because it was the fate of the Republic that was at stake. So the fate of the Republic, of the state of law, is totally opposed to the law itself. So it's a major scandal. The point is that no media wanted really to go and investigate on my account and on their account. It happens now, 25 years later, but of course it's 25 years later, and politicians are all discredited, and the oligarchy is betting on chaos. So, Balladur, when he was asked about the validation of Roland Dumas, when he was asked about the validation of Balladur's and Chirac's accounts, he said, without any embarrassment, that Balladur and Chirac had been clever, and that had been rather clumsy. So it's a way to say that law is based not on principles, but if you are tricky or not. And it's not even true, because my accounts were certified by accountants and by auditors. And the auditors and the accountants were absolutely shocked. They even accepted not to be paid when they saw the decision of the Constitutional Council. And everybody knows that what happened. They say that clearly now that even the official radio, while they have regularly pleaded that doubt must benefit the candidate, these members of the Constitutional Council, in the case of the Chirac and Balladur accounts, the wise men have decided to sanction the small candidate. I repeat that because it's an absolute disgrace for this Constitutional Council as it is organized. So the highest expression of the law of the nation acted as a gathering of a political mafia where people were discussing how to arrange the accounts of the candidates and club and eliminate the small one. So this is very similar, not in the same extent, but in the way they acted, as what they did to Snowden or Julian Assange. They considered me de facto as a whistleblower who was extremely dangerous and had to be eliminated. His voice had to be shut. This is what happened. But what is the key question at this point to consider this scandal? Why they had to go so far as to organize it? Why they had to go so far as to organize this scandal? It measures both the immediate power, they had the power to do it, but also the evil mental vulnerability. They did it because they were afraid, and they were like a wounded tiger who goes after men to eat them. It's exactly the same type of psychological impulse that led them to do that. Why then they feared me so much? When, in their terms of me and power, I was, as the fabulist La Fontaine says, an excrement of the earth. Why an excrement of the earth, with no money and no masses behind him, threatens them so much? A few reasons of that are relevant and useful to understand here and now. First, they had in front of them an independent mind, committed to try to follow the accomplishments of the best people from the past, what Lyndon LaRouche stressed as a sense of immortality of earlier generations. From them, it is allowed and even valid to mention the names of these people, but not to be inspired by their deeds. To take it seriously is not allowed in their salon. Today, for example, in France, everybody pretends to be a follower of Charles de Gaulle. in words. But practically, nobody understands what Lyndon LaRouche said about him during the New Hampshire primary election of 1980 and on February 28, 2011 in Executive Intelligence Review, a reflection of Charles de Gaulle. And what we wrote together, Lyndon LaRouche and myself, I must say that he wrote most of it, in a book, The France after de Gaulle, La France après de Gaulle, France after de Gaulle. What Lyndon LaRouche says is that the function of a president is not to make laws and laws after laws. It's to inspire a national contribution to the future of humanity, based not on existing opinions, but on discoveries of previously unknown universal principles. And de Gaulle created the political environment for those discoveries, which produced in a relatively small country like France, the Concorde, which was the first supersonic commercial airplane and was killed by the financial interests, including American financial interests, and also allowed France to become the first country in the world to have 80% of its electricity produced by nuclear plants, which are trying now to destroy or slow down. These guarantees of national independence, it's what is targeted today. Now, in 1995, I was concretely attacked because I was defending this sense of the nation. And then I am here now, almost 80 years old, still stepping up front, and that they can't accept. Having been a close friend and collaborator of Lyndon LaRouche is something they can't stand. And often, the most clever people among them, they say, well, we can allow to keep you going, but please don't mention Lyndon LaRouche. This is, of course, a bad joke, even if some of our former members who left us ungraciously fell for it. Third, in 1995, I denounced the financial crisis to come between 10 to 12 years from then, if nothing was going to be changed. Everybody speaks about a crisis today. You see that in all the media, without mentioning any meaningful solution, of course. But people speak about the crisis. But in 1995, it was forbidden to say it, for Lyndon LaRouche and for myself. When it took place 13 years after, in 2008, they had silenced me, trying to throw me aside like a piece of old furniture, like a piece of old food in the garbage can. They did not manage to destroy our movement then. But, as in the United States, they prevented us in France to reach a position of leadership, and they established for us, and in particular for me, a bad reputation. You know what LaRouche said, he's a bad guy, but we don't know why. The same thing in France. All of a sudden, journalists, people that meet me, or important people, they have a strange glance in their eyes when they look at me. The best people feel guilty of what they accepted to be done. Others feel guilty that they have not smashed me enough. So this is the situation. They did and do not give me the benefit of have forecasted the crisis, like Lynn. And fourth, and finally, already in 1995, but mainly in 2017, in the 2017 presidential election, I have been the only candidate to denounce the colonial French overseas Euro-African currency, what they call the franc CFA, the French for Africa, a true monetary slavery imposed upon most of the French-speaking Africa. This makes me very much appreciated in Africa, by young Africans in particular, but much less by the French elites I call them the French elites of whitewashed sepulchres, the biblical name for oligarchs. Fifth, I called in 1995 for an Eurasian land bridge as a project for the whole humanity, as a platform for the whole humanity, leading towards a world land bridge called for by Lynn and LaRouche. To call for an alliance of sovereign states from the Atlantic to the Urals, as de Gaulle did, was already seen as an inadmissible threat for the oligarchy. But to call, as I did, for an Eurasian land bridge from the Atlantic to the Sea of China, including Asia and the United States, this was worse than a crime. Now that the Chinese are developing their One Belt, One Road policy, in part conceived through the works of Lynn and LaRouche, I am not only considered as a LaRouche agent, but as a sort of Chinese promoter. Truly, our enemies are stupid, but they are becoming more and more evil, like wounded tigers, as I said, in a world that escapes to their control, and they play on chaos to impose their order through fear. Opening, in fact, the Pandora box of world war. As Plato, in his seventh book of the Republic, defined it, the oligarchy is a class of owners, true bumblebees of the human race, of the human species, but much more harmful than the like-minded of the winged kind, because they are armed with dangerous pricks. So I stop here, only to add that the worst of all dangers that we represent for them, for such an oligarchy, is that we have a different way of thinking, always striving for solutions, above the logics and axioms of any established system, at the level of the coincidence of the opposites, as Elga defined it. For us, truth, beauty, and justice are one, the conscience of the immortality of our principles. For them, more power and success are the way to avoid, an earthly success, are the way to avoid the fear of physical death. The laws for them is an instrument of their possession, and they violate them according to their interests, while for us it is a fraction of our principles. That's why, against all odds, we have no other choice than to win. Not for us. As I said, I am not claiming justice for me, but I am claiming justice for the future of humanity and the common good. We have to win for the future of the human race, which is our commitment to immortality, what makes us human. So, I hope that we are going to fight even more tomorrow than we have been fighting until now. Thank you.
Jacques, thank you very much for that. I want to use that to segue to something that needs to be talked about, which is the exoneration of Lynn and LaRouche. And I want to say a few things about the issue that has actually confronted the American people, which will come out in the case of Donald Trump. It will come out both, and has already begun to come out, in the case of the failure of the legal cases. One can argue about whether they could have been better prepared, whether certain things could have been changed. But actually, for those of us who are veterans of the LaRouche movement, we know exactly the ground upon which the president has now been forced to tread. It should be remembered that Robert Mueller played a role in the persecution of Lyndon LaRouche back in 1987. That persecution had to be done because of the breakout that had been accomplished by the LaRouche movement. LaRouche and his associates broke through the containment of the establishment's top-down dictatorship over the presidential process between 1976 and 1986, which set the precedent for a similar breakthrough that would happen 30 years later in 2016. But we then earned the undying enmity of the international financial oligarchy centered in the city of London. And so we're going to now show you something about that so that you can place what Jacques has just told you in the American context. And then we'll continue with our discussion.
On March 18, 1986, the world was stunned by the news that two candidates from the Democratic Party's growing LaRouche faction, Mark Fairchild and Janice Hart, had won nomination to statewide offices in the Illinois primary. During the Democratic Party primaries of 1984 and 86, dozens of candidates associated with Lyndon LaRouche received more than 30 or 40% of the vote for statewide or congressional nominations. The Hart and Fairchild victories showed that a growing plurality of the Democratic voters was turning to support the LaRouche faction within the Democratic Party. There is a deepening crisis in our national life. As this crisis worsens, more and more citizens are searching for a new kind of political leadership. For this reason, over the years since the 1970s, the fame and influence of Lyndon LaRouche has grown rather steadily, from obscurity back in 1975 to his worldwide recognition of today. Back during the years between 1975 and 78, long before LaRouche's name was known to most voters, parts of our liberal establishment decided that Lyndon LaRouche was a potential threat to their political power and to their policies. Even back then, the establishment encircled LaRouche with a ring of political containment. As one Washington Post editorial page feature back in 1976 stated, the liberal news media policy has been, for more than 10 years, almost never to report what Lyndon LaRouche does, except to attack him with brief, coordinated campaigns of wild name-calling and fictitious accusations. Between the years 1983 and 85, that news media containment began to break apart. In the March 1986 Illinois primary, LaRouche zoomed to national political prominence.
Political extremist Lyndon LaRouche. Political extremist Lyndon LaRouche. Political extremist Lyndon LaRouche.
Political extremist Lyndon LaRouche.
You should be concerned that the LaRouche menace is alive and well in the United States.
How you went from being socialist revolutionaries to neo-Nazis camouflaged as Democrats.
He is obsessed with Teutonic musical forms.
Because I think they're scared to death of Lyndon LaRouche.
And so if you want to know how you got to December of 2020, you've just seen it. What we're going to do now is go to a discussion We have questions. And again, if you have questions for us, you can just contact us at schillerinstitute.org. There it is, questions at schillerinstitute.org. I sometimes forget that. And I believe we have someone on the Zoom right now. We go for that one first.
Oh, hello.
Yep.
Hi. Okay. Hi. Yes. Excuse me. I know it's a rather intrusive view of my bedroom. I don't like it. I hope you don't either. First of all, I want to thank all of you for having this wonderful presentation, especially you, Jacques, because I keep thinking back to this principle of principle and the future. I mean, in my contemporary, I didn't get to know Lin, really. I had a few interactions with him here and there. I never really knew him on a personal level, and yet I feel so involved and committed into making sure that his name gets cleared and that he gets a pardon and that people really know who he is. And I wonder if people felt that way too back in ancient Greece when Socrates was having his trial. I mean, he was unfairly persecuted, and now Lin didn't get his victory while he was still alive. And, you know, that's a tragedy. But there's another higher idea here where he actually does win in the future. And I think some would say that that's a better victory. He gets vindicated by history. But is it that simple to where history will absolve people or correct people or correct things here or there? I think that's what some people would say, that history alone will prove me right. I think Fidel Castro said that too. But I think what you're saying is something different. It's not that history will absolve you, it's that the future will prove you right, not the past, which I think is a beautiful idea, because I think Lin was right then, that you could never go wrong if you put your victory in the future. So then what does that mean then? And what does what all of us are doing here mean? How far out will Lin's influence extend? And how can we make sure that these kind of things don't happen again? I think Lin was trying to make sure that a December of 2020 didn't happen. And I'm sure he wouldn't want somebody else in the future to be persecuted like he was. But none of us are going to be around then. 500 years from now, we're not going to be alive. So how do we make sure that 500 years from now, this doesn't happen? And I'll just say one more thing. I've heard that Henry VII was a good king, but the problem is he died. And then we got Henry VIII. Is there a way to create Henry VII's? Or is it not about having good leaders? Is there something more to that? So I hope I made some sense there.
Jacques, you want to answer? Yes,
I think that you should. Good. Yeah, now it works. I think that you should put in your mind the examples, in particular, of Lin when during 5 years, he was in jail and wrote in jail with a pencil and a piece of paper things that are an inspiration for all of us. And he broke through what is imposed to us as a gag, as a baillon, as they say in France. I got from a friend of Julian Assange in France an information which is extremely interesting. He said that in England, in Great Britain, they have organized a specific body of control, what they call the gag, of journalists, people in politics, involving politics, and intelligence. And these people decide what has to be said or not to be said in the press. And the problem is, of course, them, but also all the others that submit to that, instead of thinking historically in what was accomplished by humanity, and much more than that, what with these examples you should accomplish for the future. And in that sense, you should also put in your mind Lin, of course, and people like Dennis Small or Mike Billington or others, and for Billington and Small, their beautiful wives also, that fought when they were in jail, and they spent many years in jail. Mike Billington spent many years in jail, and it's extraordinary to see them now as representatives of truth, beauty, and justice in the way they behave. And if you put that in your mind, you will not be intimidated by the earthly powers.
Okay. Harley, you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I would just say simply that there's a very useful Yiddish proverb which addresses this question. It says, "Truth never dies, but it lives a miserable life." Now, the idea that ultimately we will come to accept truth, this is not a passive process. And this is, I think, the message that Lynn had, the quotes I was reading about his comments about leadership. You have to approach the world with a philosophical perspective, a scientific philosophical perspective. And in that sense, you're not expecting earthly rewards. Doesn't mean you intend to live a miserable life, but it means that you are committed to something that is not determined from status, from money, from prestige, but from your commitment to living up to the principles of great people who went before. And not only the great people who went before, but the large numbers of people who were influenced by them and created our society so that we today have the possibility to fight for a better future. So I think the key point here is that there are universal principles by which we can determine what is right, what is wrong, and what's not being communicated today through the education system, through the political system, is that in fact it's those universal principles which will determine the future. And that was always Lynn's approach, that you have to look for that dynamic process, which is often outside of spoken language or communication. And that's the importance that Lynn always placed on classical culture and the arts, that it's these higher faculties of human creativity which ultimately will determine the future. And that's what should give you courage when you take up the problems of talking to a largely illiterate population that doesn't realize they're being manipulated. But they can be brought to see that. And I think what we've seen in the United States in the last months is a kind of awakening which reflects what happened in 2016 worldwide and which is continuing. That people want a better world and they want to fight for truth. And those of us who have dedicated our lives to finding the method of determining what's good and right will have quite an audience out there that's available for us to educate and guide into this battle. So that's what I would say.
Okay, very good. No follow-up, right?
Yeah, well, I would just say then, does that mean then that this will then bleed on? Well, I guess I kind of answered my own question because here I am asking you guys this, and all of you were fighting this before even I was around, and then here I am, 22, trying to pick up the same fight that you guys are doing. And that, I guess that means that when I'm however old you guys are, I got to talk to some 22-year-old and make sure he does what I do, and then make sure that when he's 77, he talks to a 22-year-old over Zoom or whatever the heck.
No, actually, you actually have to do that now. You need to do that for this week, for next week's conference, which is on December 12th and 13th, okay, creating a world based on reason. The more of us that do that, the less of us will be sitting here talking about trying to get the President of the United States back into the presidency of the United States. A bit of an absurd situation. Okay, but thanks a lot for the question. I just want to return us to the Philip Sokolibane proposal. I just want to, because I need to get responses from both Jacques and Harley that we can use in the building of our conference. So he said, nearly 2 months ago, I appealed to the American President, Donald Trump, that he mobilize the full resources of his powerful nation, including the great power that is the American military, to bring the necessary aid to Africa to deal with the onrushing mass death that these twin crises, the health crisis and the food famine crisis, are bringing to my continent. Only that type of mobilization led by the American presidency and joined by the other great nations of this planet, including President Putin's Russia and President Xi's China, has the potential to reverse the greatest threat of genocide faced by Africa in this century. In repeating the warnings of the executive director of the World Food Program and friend of Donald Trump, Mr. David Beasley, that unless food were brought to people who needed it, as many as 300,000 people a day would soon be dying, I was indeed trying to shock people into sanity out of their often narrow-minded concerns of their personal present, to impel them to act and to support bold action by President Trump. While I understand Mr. Trump's necessary focus on the recently conducted fraudulent election, which the global elites have used to anoint their chosen empty suit, Joe Biden, as the president-elect, President Trump must act decisively on these matters if millions of Africans are not to die. The president is still the president no matter what the fake news media and the murderous establishment says. And then it has a series of measures, which I'm only going to indicate that he has the power to declare an emergency and to give America's farmers the mission of raising the food that Africa needs. That as commander-in-chief, President Trump has the power to order the U.S. military, whose civilian command he recently seized from the proponents of perpetual war and death, to use its resources in concert with the World Food Program. He talks about making the vaccines available and says that the president can order the U.S. military to assist in the distribution of anti-COVID medicines. So those are some of the measures, and I'd just like to get responses, I think, first from you, Jacques, and then from you, Harley, to this.
Well, first, I must say that President Trump should listen to the wise words of David Beasley and get rid of Mike Pompeo. Because on the issue of Yemen, Pompeo wants to put the Houthis to give them the status of war terrorists. And then the Houthis would not be in a position to receive American food that they need. There are tens of thousands of people that are threatened by death of hunger. So that's the issue, and it's a very immediate issue. It's only one case, but it's very significant as a symbol of all what has to be done in our program to feed people in the South. You have, at this point, this informal economy, which is in fact an economy of slavery, which prevents people to go out and to care for their daily needs, including to eat. So we have to change that. This means that American farmers, but European farmers as well, should organize the sending of food to where it's needed. But at the same time, we should help them to organize themselves for stocking the food. At this point in Africa and in different other parts of the world, the food is threatened by rodents. So we need stocking places. We need also cold chains to maintain the food. We need also transportation for the food. At this point, 40 to 60% of the food produced in Africa is lost. So we need this commitment for Africa, which will be the litmus test, as we said in the past, for all humanity. And Africa at this point should be a commitment, and this should be given as a present for the future to the whole American population and European population. And instead of thinking of this and that, the leaders of the West should commit themselves to do just that, and that would change the situation.
Yeah, Harley?
I think Philip mentioned that one of the problems you have in dealing with this is what he called a narrow-minded approach. And I think before I say anything more, I want to say that on some level, President Trump has responded. Beasley has reported that the U.S. increased its commitment to the World Food Program a little bit, where more money was made available. But what's the real issue here? And I want to come back to the quote I read from Lyndon LaRouche about self-interest. Most Americans, when confronted with something like famine in Africa, their initial response is, well, what's in it for us? We've got enough problems here to deal with for ourselves. Why don't they take care of it? It's their own fault, and on and on and on. And they're missing something important. The people who created the world in which we can shrug our shoulders at starvation in Africa are the ones moving ahead with this global digitalized currency regime, the bankers' dictatorship, which will increase the poverty in the United States. We've already seen an increase in numbers of people who are not food self-sufficient, young people who don't have enough food. It's the British system, the colonial system, which survived after World War II, at least in terms of international financial institutions, control over the distribution of food, the way the International Monetary Fund uses food as a weapon, the way trade agreements force poor African countries to export their food to make money, and they don't get enough money from that to replace the food they exported. It's a corrupt system which is collapsing, and it's collapsing on the heads of everyone in the world except the Davos billionaires who think they have a way out of this. So if you actually recognize what is the self-interest of American and European farmers, but also the average person in the transatlantic region, it's to end the system of British economic domination, which controls virtually every aspect of life. Now, that's not to say we should do it selfishly because we're being affected by the same thing. It's that one must recognize that the way we look at people in Africa, as Helga LaRouche has always said, is a moral test for us. If we can be indifferent in the face of suffering, which is not caused by so-called natural things, but by deliberate policies, then we fail that test. And we shouldn't be surprised if those kinds of crises then turn around and hit us. So I think the question of self-interest, the way Lyndon LaRouche defined it, should cause us to do something different. And I think President Trump could play a major role in this. And it would go a long way toward breaking this whole racial aspect of the anti-Trump deployment, were he to simply say, this is a moral commitment we're going to make sure we're not going to allow people to starve, children to starve in Africa.
Okay, thank you. We have a question, Jacques. This is for you, and this is from Tony in Chicago. He asked this. He says, this week, former French President Giscard d'Estaing died of COVID. In 1979 and 1980, he worked with German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt on the European Monetary Fund, echoing closely what LaRouche was proposing at that time. Can you explain this and say how this is relevant for today?
Well, I don't know if you noticed, I have a picture of Charles de Gaulle there behind me. So there was, after de Gaulle's death and during the presidency of Georges Pompidou, his former prime minister, a deviation of the initial spirit of the nation state redefined by de Gaulle. De Gaulle talked of a directed economy. He could not fully implement it, notably with the African countries, because the international situation did not allow him to do it. Certain aspects of his African policy were questionable because he was cornered. But the principle is there. And what you have today, if you look at it from the standpoint of what's happening in the United States, and forget about Giscard d'Estaing, who has disappeared as a ghost of the past, but let's look what's happening today in the United States. You have Janet Yellen appointed as Secretary of the Treasury Secretary. Janet Yellen wants to unite the Federal Reserve and the Treasury to create the conditions of more and more issuing of fake money for the financial oligarchy. That's her job in the Biden administration if it takes place, if this happens. It's a worse danger than you can imagine. It's probably even worse in terms of the effect than what the other members of the Biden administration have in mind. It's coherent with what they have in mind, but it's a basis. Then it's what I call it the worst. At this point, you have the opposite policy. The opposite policy is a policy of Hamilton, the Hamiltonian policy. It's a constitutional principle in the United States of the general welfare. And this is a basis for a national bank which should issue money for the real common good, for the needs of the people in the future, for the future generations. And this should be the policy that has to be followed. And it has to be explained to people how it's crucial to go in that direction. So this is the issue where Helmut Schmidt and Giscard d'Estaing had at the same time a bias, an oligarchical bias, and a lot of illusions. Now things are much more clear. You have us against the oligarchical illusions.
Very good.
And crime.
This question is from Daniel in New York. I'm going to give this to you, Harley, first. And he says this. He says, paradoxically, totalitarianism, the totalitarianism of today's system is not defined by the number of tortured people. This dictatorship alleges that it wants to save the planet, and it has only one model, and it wants to dictate in one direction. They have an ambition to to destroy privacy, which has been the ambition of all totalitarian systems, and now they think they can achieve it. They talk about the fight for democracy, human rights, and free markets, but these markets were not free at all. This is only the necessary verbal sauce for a more powerful, dominant corporation, and the people who are paid to be in positions by these people to carry out acts of corruption. And the question here is, how can we overcome the moral relativism that tolerates this and allows for these democratic words to be used to cover for a dictatorial objective? So I'll give that to you first, Harley, and then if Jacques wants to say something about that.
Well, the other day, Helga LaRouche expressed her disgust at hearing people such as the Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the European Union, talking about human rights and talking about democracy, when the project or the program of the European Union toward immigrants is to push them into the ocean to drown. You have a form that goes beyond sophistry when it comes to language, but it's a use of words in such a way as to accomplish the opposite of what the word actually means. For example, we're seeing this with the people being nominated for the Biden cabinet, which hopefully will never take place. But Tony Blinken, who is this guy? He's a promoter of something called the responsibility to protect. Now, what is the responsibility to protect? Blinken, in his official biography, says that he's opposed to totalitarianism and authoritarianism because of the experience that one of his grandparents had in escaping from a Nazi concentration camp, and therefore he's committed to democracy and human rights. Well, democracy and human rights, he said that his greatest regret from the time he spent in the Obama administration was not convincing Obama to do more bombing in Syria, when in fact there was an incredible amount of bombing being done by the Obama administration. He's opposed to pulling troops out of Afghanistan. He was a full supporter of the Obama-Biden regime change in Ukraine, which brought to power in the security and defense forces of Ukraine Nazi battalions to impose the EU and NATO policy on Ukraine. This is a responsibility to protect human rights. What about what was done in Libya by Hillary Clinton and Obama in conjunction with Sarkozy and Cameron of England? They destroyed a nation that was developing. Why? To protect democracy, supposedly, when in fact they turned the country into a hellhole dominated, at least in its capital, by Islamic jihadist forces. So this is an example of the problem when you have words like responsibility to protect, which are used to justify regime change wars. Now we're seeing a regime change that's being carried out in the United States. And I think what people, to really understand this election fight, this is the culmination of a regime change operation set in motion at the end of 2015, early 2016, by British intelligence, by GCHQ, brought in later with the MI6, working with Brennan, Clapper, Comey, and others, the Obama intelligence team. So, we can show people the hypocrisy of these characters talking about human rights and democracy. The other part of this problem is the media censorship, the lies, the fake news of the media. But the benefit we have, and it's a strange way to say this is a benefit, is increasingly people are turning that off. They're turning away from it. They're looking for something else. We have to be more effective and creative at bringing people into the real world as opposed to just a reaction against the fake media. And that's why I think it's so important. One of the best things we can do is organize like hell for the conference this next week, the 12th and the 13th, the Schiller Institute conference, so people can get a view of what actually does exist in the world, what potentials there are, what problems there are, and what they can do about it, how they can be part of a solution. So, we're in a world that would make the creatures who created George Orwell's 1984 green with envy by the way they're controlling the discussion. But as in Orwell's 1984, it's difficult to control a discussion as long as there are creative people who have courage, who will wage a fight against them. And we just have to be more visible, more effective, and people should support us, should contribute to us, should join the Schiller Institute, should become part of our movement to fight this and make us more visible.
I think I'll do this. I'll take one final question for today. This is from Bruce from New Jersey, and he's asking, can Harley or Jacques, and I think we're going to ask both of you to do this, comment on the fact that we have much more in common with the best of the Platonic and Confucian traditions of most countries than we have differences. And he specifically references China, Russia, and even Great Britain. So why don't we start with you, Harley, and then go to Jacques?
Well, it's a big question. Look, the question that is posed by this is partly the theme that Helga has of the coincidence of opposites. But the coincidence of opposites is you always have to look for a higher resolution to what seems to be an intractable problem. And, I've been talking a lot about this in terms of the Russia-China situation. A very simple point. What most people are missing when they say China's our enemy, China's working to destroy us. Who's out to destroy China? It's the same military-industrial complex that needs an enemy image to organize trillion-dollar defense contracts and budgets. It's the same people like George Soros who is conducting a regime change against Russia and the United States. What is in common between the United States, Russia, and China? Historically, Dennis referred to this in the beginning, that there were ambassadors sent by Lincoln who found a very common tradition, a commitment to work together. The Russians were our allies at the American Revolution during the Civil War and the two world wars in the 20th century. Doesn't mean we loved the system of socialism, the communist system of the Soviet Union, but that we had something in common. And I think that's the question that's posed by what Bruce is asking. How do you get people to look beyond the attempt to create an enemy image to discover what there is in another culture that is reflected in the best of our own tradition? And that's why I think he brought up the question of Confucius and Plato. But I think if you actually look at Russian history, and I know a little bit more about this than Chinese history, but in Russian history, you have a great culture, a great tradition that was fighting against an oligarchy for a long time. And the point at which that could have succeeded with the time of the fall of communism, what was done to highlight the differences? We sent in a bunch of bankers and thieves from the United States and England, from Harvard, and not England, from Britain and Harvard, to basically loot Russia under the Yeltsin years, sending Russia into a demographic tailspin. And instead of working with Russia, which had just come out from under 70 years of communism, we created a circumstance for most Russians that was worse. Now, that brings me to the other part of his question when I have to laugh when he said, what about Britain? I think this is a very interesting topic. I'm just beginning to look into this more because of a lot of communications I'm getting from people who say, look, I'm English, I'm not British. And if you look at what we mean by Britain, we're not talking about the people of England. We're talking about the monarchy, we're talking about the City of London, and we're talking about the intelligence institutions such as GCHQ, MI5, and MI6. And what we have in common is that the people of England want to have a sovereign nation. They don't want to be dominated by this predatory system. And so in all of these cases, we can find common interests. And I think one of the things, to get back to China for a second, that President Trump saw when he met with Xi Jinping was an excitement about the potential to work together, to not just lift people out of poverty, but to develop bridges between nations based on the most advanced science and technology. That is what Xi Jinping calls a win-win policy. And that's the way that we can get out of this crisis now, by looking at those kind of higher commitments to a better future. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, and Jacques?
Well, it's funny because I just met through these video conferences an English woman. And she was disoriented, and she said that, what can I do? Everything is bad in my country. So I told them, you should do immediately something. Read or reread Othello and The Merchant of Venice. And you will find that you can become English against the British, that you can discover in yourself the basis for this treasure of islands that Shakespeare once described as England. And then you have a commitment to humanity, and then we can discuss the issue. What another friend of mine told me, he's involved with the Yellow Vests, he told me the question of this society is that fascism is progressing under the cover of anti-fascism. And I think it's very, very important to see how the oligarchy proceeds. Because if you read Plato's Republic, you see that, and it's known that Socrates says that Thrasymachus is crazy to think, he doesn't say it that way, but it's what it means, to think that he is guided by his violent self. So that force is the basis for justice, that strength is the basis for justice. He said no, because it's unprincipled. But then, as important is the polemics against Polemarchus. Polemarchus says that justice is to benefit one's friend and to crush one's enemies. And if you have this conception, you would create evil. It's very different from Martin Luther King's conception of why you should love your enemies. It's not what the enemies said or what they pretend to be, but to find the principle of humanity in everybody. And that's the issue of the United States and the Soviet Union, Russia, as Lyndon LaRouche defined, with a strategic defense initiative, a basis for a community of development based on new physical principles and the development for the benefit of all. So I think if you think that way, you are above these fake notions of justice, and you can understand how each human being that you talk has in herself or himself something that could be organized. And organizing is, I think, the principle of permanent discovery of that in the others. And if you accomplish that, you would change also yourself. This is what Martin Luther King says, that you will change yourself and become better. And you should then understand that you can't stay aside, that the principle, the person in a republic is a citizen, and a citizen is a person who is committed to intervene in all issues to increase and enlarge the notion of republic. And this is very urgent today when the anti-republican principle is spreading in all the West.
All right, as a way of concluding, I'd like to just pick up from what you just said, Jacques, and these will be the final statements from you and Harley today, because what's happened in the United States over the past 2 weeks, 3 weeks in particular, is that thousands of persons who probably would have had no idea that they would have been doing this found themselves filling out legal affidavits, various other legal documents, in defense of the right to vote, but also not only in defense of the right to vote, in defense of the actual presidential electoral process. Now, for years, even decades, there's been a big debate about this issue of using voting machines, computerized ballots, so forth and so on. But importantly, they have found themselves having to defend the republic. Now, some of them are doing that because they have a partisan outlook toward President Donald Trump. Some of them are not. As we found last week with our International Commission on Truth in Elections, we had testimony from one man, Benny Smith, who was a Democrat, who made it very clear that his point was, well, the matter here is that there must be a justice to the electoral process. Clearly, I want to have my candidate win. But, you know, when candidates lose, often you can then become reflective. Maybe I lost because I'm not proposing the right ideas. And so maintaining, preserving the integrity of a process like that, which is one of the few times that the individual is able to exercise the power over government as a whole, is essential. And so given what we've been discussing about the presidency and discussing about the idea of seeking the presidency, and then the cost that you pay when you seek the presidency, and then what was posed by Jose concerning the issue of triumphing in a real sense over the false ideas that stop people from being able to exercise the general welfare on behalf of ourselves and our posterity. I'd like first, Jacques, for you to say something in conclusion, and then we'll go to Harley.
Well, the only thing that I should say is act and organize. Organize is to change the others and to change yourself to both be better in a better world. And this means the coincidence of the opposites as a driving force of our Sheila conference. And I will repeat what Harley said: organize for that conference, organize at the same time for justice in the United States, because it's a one, to fight against vote fraud in the United States, to reestablish the principle of the presidency, and to organize for this conference is a one. And you should, in your minds, think of that as a one, and you would see that if you look at it and look at it from the standpoint of what is needed from you in the present world, you would immediately move.
All right, thank you. Harley?
I think back to something Lyndon LaRouche once told us when we were gathered with a group of young people in the hills outside of California. And in little discussion afterwards, someone said to him, well, how can you keep doing this when you get less than 1% of the vote? And he said, well, I don't know that I'm getting less than 1%. They may be stealing a lot of votes from me. In fact, we know they are. But I'm not doing this to be president. I'm doing this because I have a mission in my life. I have something more important, and I'm never going to give that up. And he had this saying, he said, they can't beat you if you don't quit. And I think it's useful to look at President Trump sticking to his conviction on this, that he's willing to keep fighting because he knows it's not just about his presidency, but it's about the Constitution and the country. And I think, as Lyndon LaRouche put it, you're not beaten if you don't quit. And so we can't quit on this, and take that spirit of fight and inspire a similar response in others. And that's the only way you can win, because the other side has money, they've got power, but they're stupid and they believe that you're going to give up. And if you don't give up, eventually they're going to have to.
All right. Well, I want to thank Jacques Cheminade and Harley Schlanger for joining us today. As you've heard many, many times now during this course of the last couple of hours, we're going to be having our conference. Both of them will be addressing that conference next week, Saturday, December 12th and 13th. The World After the United States Election, Creating a World Based on Reason, will be starting at 9 a.m. There'll be 2 panels each day, and you're all welcome and urged to register and to have other people view that conference and participate in it. I want to say a final word as we now go to the conclusion. Look at the presidencies of the United States, particularly that of Washington and Hamilton, the first presidency, that of Abraham Lincoln, and that of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Each one of these were revolutionary presidencies. They were revolutionary because they, in some fashion, either established, preserved, or implemented the concept of the United States Constitution, particularly with respect to the idea of the general welfare. But more importantly, they created self-government, the concept of self-government, and extended that notion of self-government to a form of power which became expressed as economic power that allowed them, these presidencies, and to initiate forms of revolution that meant that people all over the world could be free of various forms of slavery, whether that be serfdom, chattel slavery, as in the case of the United States and other nations, or wage slavery, as it's sometimes called. The idea of where we are today, in looking at the United States, is that the accumulation of wealth that occurred in America was not about individual self-aggrandizement and the fiercely competitive individual entrepreneur who triumphed in a social Darwinist way over everyone else because of his cutthroat ability to make the right deal. What happened with President Donald Trump in the last month or so, which became a conclusion, is a 4-year process which is intended to end the American presidency. The American presidency as an institution has been under assault, particularly since the time of September 11th, 2001, and in a different way since November 22nd of 1963. But now we're at the point that the issue is whether or not the people of the United States intend to commit themselves to the original design of this nation. The purpose was to change the standard of truth that humanity was caused to live under. Earlier, before the Declaration of Independence, the notion that there were truths that, such as all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And among those rights were the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to the pursuit of happiness. And that to secure those rights, governments were instituted among men deriving their powers from the just consent of the governed. That didn't exist. That was invented. It wasn't invented in 1776. It began to be invented in 1439 in Florence, Italy, by a man by the name of Nicholas of Cusa. But it was finally consummated in the form of that document in 1776, and then a war was fought to preserve that and to advance that. Abraham Lincoln's role was to internationalize that, and he internationalized that in a peculiar way by the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad, an invention, again. And that invention was allowed for, instead of the simple population of the shores of continents and the rivers of continents, that the interiors could be developed. And the idea of the interior development of continents is a revolutionary principle that now is underway and is seen in places like China and Russia and would be seen in the United States if the United States had a free presidency. Most of the things that people are complaining about, either coming from China or other nations, from the standpoint of the development of those nations, are ideas abandoned by the United States in the past half century. because we abandon the idea of progress, specifically scientific and technological progress that transforms nature, that improves nature. Because the human being is a natural phenomenon, but the purpose of the human being, as seen through reason, is to improve nature. And this is done through economic policies, the idea of what's called the increase in potential relative population densities. More people are better. The world is only better, and nature is only better when there are more people consuming more, producing more, thinking more, and acting freely. Now, that's a different conception of truth. Humanity needs to act without the false necessity of catastrophe. That's for animals. They can't help it. They don't have a way to think about the universe as a whole, to act upon the universe as a whole, to change the universe as a whole, and to improve it. But that is the destiny, the nature, and the mission of humanity, including outside of this planet, outside of this solar system, and even outside of this galaxy. This is the principle for which the American Revolution was fought. It's why many of the American revolutionaries were themselves scientists, such as Ben Franklin. And it's why today, when we look at the issue of preserving the American presidency, including in the present fight around the so-called vote fraud, what we're really looking at is preserving the capacity of humanity as a whole to explore the universe and to develop itself to be competent to populate it. So as we ask you now, again, we conclude, and ask you to participate now in thinking about a world based on reason, we ask you to act as citizens if you are in the United States, and if you're outside of the United States, as citizens of your nations, to help us here not only preserve this principle, to extend this principle, and it is that which is the true reason and purpose and mission that all of us anywhere in the world have as human beings. And that's why the poet Friedrich Schiller is the inspiration for what it is we will be doing next week, and we hope that you will be doing with us. So on behalf of the Schiller Institute, I want to thank everybody for being with us today, and we'll see you next week, 9 a.m., for the Schiller Institute conference.